so it was a clear hit, but I need to rewrite like theoretical parts, and they expect me to prove the idea, that I developed as Food Photo Gallery being like a time capsule, when lots of changes has occurred to photography, and Alex has managed to keep his space, very unique and like old style. So they want me to talk, to write about changes that happened to photography, since 1970s to now, to prove that he stayed kind of the same. So they asked me certain questions that I wanted to ask you.
Okay, go ahead and ask me. I'll do my best to try to give you short, coherent answers.
Sure, yeah.
It's a big thing you're trying to bite off.
So I first need to talk about the beginning, 1970s, the beginning of different writings on photography as art. So what impact did Zondag, Bard, and A.D. Coleman had, and why, for example, Zondag and Bard are so important in academic studies and programs?
From starting with the 60s into the 70s?
Starting from 1970s.
Yeah, because you see, I think especially the 60s and probably up to the mid-70s, you had these kind of two areas of the medium. The social documentary, or you had the high aestheticism of minor white. And they were kind of conceptual and political polar opposite. Minor white may have been a political person, but I don't think we'll ever know, because he spoke about photography as a kind of deeply personal, spiritual pursuit.
Right.
Then you had those photographers who were out in the streets trying to document in various communities all of the social turmoil and changes that were going on in America at that time. So you had this schism. And at that time, the professionalization of photography in the academy, it didn't exist. There were no MFA programs. So you didn't have this bringing together of photography and the academy. Sort of like Minor White was an academy unto himself,
So you think
if you want to think about it. And what began to happen, I think after the mid-70s, you had this kind of bringing together of social documentary and photography in the academy. So the academy and social documentary began to come together. And probably because politically they were more aligned than they were with the kind of high pseudo-spiritualism of Minor White, that branch of photography began to recede. And those photographers, primarily among them people like Gary Winogrand, began to come to the fore. The freelance, these photographers who were photographing the American social tradition, who had studied Robert Frank, who had studied Walker Evans, and who wanted to make their own contribution to a visual description of the American social landscape. But also, on top of that, imposing the kind of formalism of small picture making. So it was a combination of Henry Cartier-Bresson and Robert Frank. So at that point, you started to get a less photojournalistic kind of response photographically to the American social condition and a more photographically aestheticized response that was pretty much as much about picture making as it was about describing the American social condition. So, and Gary Winogrand, not so much Lee Freeland, but a number of those photographers began to teach in different institutions.
So do you think Zondervan and Bards opens this whole criticism and introduced photography to academia?
So I think what?
Susan Zondervan and Roland Bards introduced photography to academia and to studying of photography as a subject.
Well, that whole notion of a snapshot, I think, during that same time there was this notion of a kind of what came to be called a snapshot aesthetic, which was an almost deadpan kind of unaestheticized look at the world, but that was an aesthetic in and of itself. They called it a snapshot. I never thought that was an accurate description because it didn't look anything like the kind of snapshots that most people make. But I think they were talking about a kind of deadpan, straight on. It wasn't the kind of picture making that Minor White and that school would do. It didn't depend on a kind of heavy emotionalism so much as it depended on a kind of accumulation of particular information about the American social condition. Now, if you think about those photographers who came to be grouped together in the new topographic exhibition, but that too was a kind of picture making. It wasn't a kind of photojournalistic, let me find out who's guilty of despoiling the land and go do an expose of them. So the kind of deadpan visual description of the condition, and that work of course began to be championed by John Joukowsky and a number of other museum curators, both at MoMA and George Eastman House initially. I can't remember the curator's name of George Eastman House who brought that show together. But that was also the beginning of a kind of institutionalizing of a certain kind of picture making. And those photographers also were, both coming out of certain academic programs and also starting to teach inside of these programs, who were producing students who were also adopting these ideas. So you start to get the kind of a school of certain kinds of picture making coming out of the academy. Walker Evans was brought back by Todd Papageorge, in the 70s to teach at Yale. There were photographers independently who knew to seek out Walker Evans. Like Robert Frank studied Walker Evans' photographs very intently before he started making his own, which is very different from an individual doing the kind of study of this work and then bringing somebody into an institutional setting to teach and to kind of propagate, these ideas to students. So, Yale University and Todd Papageorge, who was very, very close to Gary Winogrand and then bringing Walker Evans in, you start to get a certain kind of photographic activity centering around the academy.
How would you describe this period of 1970s in photography?
The 70s,
What are the
the
major thoughts?
de-romanticization of photography.
De-romanticization?
Yes.
More of a social
Yes.
aspect?
Yes, it was the de-romanticization of photography, a move away from the kind of photography exemplified by Ansel Adams. A very emotional response to the landscape, a majestic response. I would say the 70s is a period of the de-romanticization of photography.
And at the same time where criticism on photography evolved, right?
Yeah, I think the flip side of that At the same time, it was being de-romanticized. There was a stronger intellectual kind of response to picture making. I think also coming out of John Tarkowski's book, looking at photographs, in which he codified. How do you look at a photograph? What is a photograph? And everyone began to speak about pictures that way, in terms of the edge, the picture plane. Not all of this emotional boom, 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 boom. Not all of that, but in a cold, kind of intellectual way, deconstructing what the photograph is as an optical object. Tarkowski gave a language to it. John Tarkowski created the language. He didn't create the pictures, but he created the language for what those pictures are doing, and by linking it up to its history, gave that kind of way of looking at, talking about, and thinking about photographs, a kind of history. So he was hugely important. On his relationship to Todd Papa George, his relationship to Gary Winogrand, Walker Evans, he was kind of like at the center, really, of that community. You know, Stephen Shore, Eggleston, Arbus, and all of those photographers, they came to prominence through Tarkowski giving them their first exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. And of course, institutions like Yale were very closely aligned with the Museum of Modern Art because of the personal relationships that were going on between people of both institutions.
So photography takes some kind of intellectual frames. What happens after that? Is it feminism?
What happens after that?
Image of women in photography?
Well, I mean, a number of things happened after that because I think because of this way of thinking about photography as a kind of conceptual activity, you also begin to see people like Ed Ruscha, who's a painter, making photographs. You begin to see this notion of artists who are not photographers using the camera. You know, now that the camera is freed from this emotional baggage, you know, that Minor White had given it. You know, and you had to know how do you translate all of these raging, deep emotions into a picture. Once it became free of its emotional baggage, and once it became this instrument of kind of optical description, and once that language was codified, other people, like Ed Ruscha and other non-photographers, began to move into the medium as well. And this notion that photography was not just photography, but photography was something that, you know, even an artist who wasn't a trained photographer.
What impact did Cindy Sherman have?
What?
Cindy Sherman, what impact did she have on photography?
Yeah, I think you get Cindy Sherman, you get people like Laurie Simmons, people both making and using photographs in their practice who are not necessarily photographers. And then, you know, you also, I mean, along with all of that, when you talk about people like Ed Ruscha, you also have the difference between what was going on in photography on the East Coast and the West Coast. But they've always been very different. You know, that whole New York school of photography and the West Coast, after the Ansel Adams and the landscape tradition, was always more conceptual. They always had a more conceptual bent. There was a huge difference between the way the history was evolving here in New York and how it evolved on the West Coast. You know, John Baldessari. On the West Coast, there began to appear even more artists who were using pictures and photographs who were not photographers per se.
So you think because photography became more available, people started utilizing it to express certain ideas, like feminism, for example?
Well, I think it was becoming, I mean, it has always been a hugely available art form, probably more so than any other. You know, with the introduction of the Kodak Brownie and this idea that, you know, you push the button, we do the rest, you push the button, you send it in, and back comes some pictures. So I think its accessibility has always been there. It's just about the various kinds of conceptual languages that began to be formed around photography. New York was just a much more hardcore place. California, they're very conceptual. You know, it's just different. And the medium would be in practice very differently, you know, in California than it was here. Even though at some point, as the history kept moving forward, and all of that work got integrated into the big stream of photographic history, you know, and as information became less regional, as movements became less regional and more national and then global, all of these languages for picture making became much more readily available. You had people like Lorna Simpson from New York who went to school in California and studied with John Baldessari and then came back to New York and began showing that work. Carrie Mae Weems went out to California. So you had people beginning to move around, which also allowed these various forms of conceptual thinking to start moving around and migrating back to places where they previously hadn't existed. So when Lorna came back with that conceptual work that she was making in the 1980s, none of us here in New York had ever seen anything like it. Now, of course, had we been from California, we would have known where that came from. But if you came out of Yale or if you came out of New York or the whole street photography tradition, that whole conceptual way of making work is just not something you're familiar with. But as folks from New York, young artists from New York, started to go to these institutions and then come back, the languages for picture making, the conceptual languages, began to be much more fluid and less regional specific. Boy, you're making me think about a lot of stuff here.
Yes, we do.
I kind of know this stuff. I don't talk about it too much. But I lived through all that history. I started making pictures in the 60s and the 70s. I started photographing seriously in 1975, photographing in Harlem. But even then, without knowing it, I was a little confused because I was trying to make pictures like Walker Evans, you know, large camera pictures with a 35 millimeter. See, because I didn't know what kind of camera he had used. I just knew I wanted to make a certain type of picture, you know. So my work has been an evolution, you know, in my own thinking as ideas about, you know, the medium have continued to evolve. Because I want to be a part of, you know, the ongoing conversation. I don't want to be making pictures now, because I was making pictures in 1975.
Why?
I don't want to be my own oldie song. I don't want to be an oldie guy. I don't want to be singing doo-wop in 2010. I mean, it's a legitimate art form, but, you know, I think the musicians understand it perfectly. You know, art forms evolve, and artists, in order to be a part of the contemporary conversation, doesn't mean that your concerns need to change radically. But as new languages become available, you should be able to have a conversation or to be able to at least situate yourself consciously in relation to that language. So you ask me why. I mean, anybody making small 35 millimeter street photographs now in a certain style is actually speaking the language of Gary Winogrand. Gary Winogrand defined that language so Winogrand. When you start doing it, somebody's going to say, oh, Gary Winogrand. You know, or if you're waiting for some decisive moment and somebody does this, oh, you're speaking Cartier-Bresson. These people were establishing languages. They weren't just making pictures.
Right.
And we have to continue to evolve, you know, languages for picture making.
So what are you left with now in terms of picture making when it looks
We're
like
left
all
with
the languages...
infinite choices. Infinite
Really?
choices. All of these languages are out there. You can pick and choose, create new hybrid forms. I mean, it's wide open now.
So do you see a tendency for appropriation in photography now?
No, not anymore.
When was
Very
it?
little
In
appropriation.
90s?
I think that whole postmodern appropriation conversation, it was interesting in the 80s while it was happening. I don't think anybody cared about that anymore. But that was entirely, you know, a theoretical conversation that was illustrated by a few pictures. You know, Cherry Levine reappropriated Walker Evans. I never cared about that, quite frankly. It was an interesting theoretical conversation that did allow all of us to think about what did it mean to be the author of an image. But I don't think it was a useless conversation, but it wasn't a conversation that could continue indefinitely.
So is it time of postmodernism? Questioning the role of the author and authorship. What else was happening in that time?
Yeah, I think at that time, you know, those questions hadn't been raised previously within photography. The whole postmodern theoretical discourse was largely, up until that point, confined to the literary arena, and then it kind of seeped into the photographic arena. And I actually think at that moment photography suffered a huge bout of insecurity, you know, thinking that we had to be engaged in that discourse, you know, rather than devising whatever kind of language and conceptual framework. So I think for a long time, you know, in the 80s, there was this moment when, especially because we had so many artists who wanted trained photographers making photographs, and kind of seizing the limelight, and bringing this kind of theoretical discourse to the medium that hadn't, you know, previously been the dominant discourse. I think there was a moment in which photographers and the medium suffered a huge inferiority complex and just handed the conversation over to the critical theorists. You know, and even if they didn't understand the language, they kind of pretended that they did, because that seemed to be what you're supposed to do. You know? But like I said, there was a useful aspect of that conversation in terms of what do you apply that critical and theoretical framework to. And I think a number of people, particularly people like Lorna Simpson and Carrie Marine, applied that to very substantial subject matter and went on to make very interesting work. Cherry Levine in the re-photograph Walker Evans, I don't know if anybody cares about that anymore.
And
Really.
she did Van Gogh as well.
Yeah, I don't think anybody cared about that. I don't think anybody cares about it now, for sure.
But was it
It's a little historical footnote. An interesting shift in the media,
Yeah.
but not a conversation that could continue indefinitely. It was just a moment to reassess what it meant to make an author a photograph.
Going back a little to 1980s, did photography acquire political connotations? Was it, you know, trying to reflect on political issues and situations? And in particular, the photographers as Martha Rosler and Alan Sekula.
Yeah.
So there was
Sekula
another
and who?
Martha Rosler.
Yeah.
So was it another twist in photography
Yeah.
where the political things played a big role?
Yeah. I think Alan Sekula, primarily on the West Coast, Martha Rosler here, with her breakthrough photographs made right here on the Bowery. Those were hugely important works too, in terms of, not only the way the Bowery was photographed at that point, but how it was thought about. And, Martha Wasser with that first group of work began to really shake up people's notions about photographic representation. And then to begin to also become a very interesting critical theorist, in addition to being practicing artist, both of them. They kind of crossed that theorist artist divide, and there were a number of people who were both influenced by their writing, and who also were students of theirs.
So what happened in School of Structuralism in photography?
Structuralism? I'm not the person to ask.
Okay.
I had an interview one time, and someone asked me, "What is your feelings about post-structuralism?" I said, "That's not my theoretical construct, so I don't talk about that, because it's not how I think about picture making. I just leave it alone." I'm sure either one of them could answer that more interestingly, but it's not my conversation.
How do you evaluate 1990s period and up until now? What were the major changes or languages established in photography? Is it that...
In my own work?
Yeah, what you think?
Well, for me, making pictures is basically two things. It's about a response to a certain subject, and it's also a way of answering certain questions that I ask myself. Once I've answered the question, it's time to raise a different set of questions. And out of those different questions comes different work. So for me, the work really comes out of continuing to ask myself a set of questions about my own practice, and to try to move the work forward by answering those questions. And that's true even of the work that I'm in the midst of doing now. I'm doing a project photographing in Atlanta. And I've been interested in the human subject for a long time. And I would say since at least the last 10, 15, 20 years, I've photographed primarily the individual, single subject.
I saw you.
That has not always been true, but primarily to take a close look at the individual. And part of it is as a way of creating a heightened presence of and for that individual, but also as a way of continuing to answer the question of how many different ways can you photograph an individual person, like how many things are gesturally, emotionally, and psychologically possible. And then I make some more pictures in order to find out. This is the first time that I'm doing a whole body of work photographing two people at a time. It's a whole different set of issues, whole different set of problems, different set of formal problems, relational problems. But because I hadn't done it, and I asked myself, well, what would it mean to do that? For me, the answer can't be theoretical. In order to answer it, I have to make it work. And so that's what I'm doing now. There's two people sitting together in a single photograph who don't know each other until I bring them together to be photographed. So they have to both respond to me and the camera and to each other. So now I've got a new challenge. Something new to work toward that will probably spill over into and continue in the work that I make after I finish this project.
One more question. You said that you paralleled asking questions to the periods. So each period, photography, we can say, has certain set of questions they ask. That's why we can see all these different languages established. But do you see the tendency now to rediscover the old photographers and to have retrospectives of Robert Frank at Lincoln Center and Eggleston? So do you see that tendency of going back to old photographers and authors now?
Yeah, for me, I have to kind of periodically push the envelope on my own practice. I admire the work of people like William Eggleston, William Christenberry, who've been going back to the same place for maybe 30 years or more, re-examining this, But for me, it's really necessary to find out something else about, this whole action idea of picture making, whether it was my move from the small 35 millimeter camera to the 4x5 camera, 4x5 film to 4x5 Polaroid material, from 4x5 Polaroid material to the 20x24 Polaroid camera, but using color. Then continuing with color, going back to the 4x5 and out of the studio and into the street. It's kind of like the work has an ongoing conversation with itself that is, directed by me in my own set of issues and questions. And I've often thought about, what if, what if I were making the kinds of pictures that I made earlier. Now, but for me, those questions have been answered. So they're no longer vibrant. They're no longer alive. They no longer require grappling with.
It's also about aesthetics that took place in those photographs and at that time. So do you go back to that as feel of things? Not.
Yeah. But the only time I did it, I did go back to Harlem in the late 80s. With a 4x5 camera, after having photographed there for 5 years at the beginning of my career with the 35 millimeter camera. And I made some interesting pictures, but at that point, it felt like I was trying to recreate something rather than find out something new, or to find out some new information, and it just didn't feel as imperative at that point.
So you think there is importance in moving forward in your means, in your techniques, in photography?
It's necessary for me. Yeah. It's necessary for me. I have to remain interested in doing this for my own set of reasons. And also the way to continue to have a conversation, with the broader photographic community in the field. And I do see my work as being a kind of conversation that I'm having with wherever photography happens to be at that particular moment. I want to be a part of that conversation.
Thank you.
I hope you got something useful there.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah, here's the man behind the camera who's also a part of the history.